There you go. And then second, if you have any questions for Joshua or Ottessa, please put them in the chat. And then if we have time at the end, we will go to those questions and we'll see if I can throw a couple of them to our presenters. So lastly, Sharon Dynack, our president and executive director, who was going to be here tonight, sends her regrets. She wasn't feeling well. So I will be sort of stepping in for her to ask some questions. I'm a poor substitute for Sharon, but I will do my best and know that she sends her love to everyone. Now, with all that said, I'm going to pass it over to Steve. Steve Jimenez is, well, Steve's many things. Steve is our Ucross fellow in his own right, a Ucross trustee for many years, and the producer of these events. So I'm going to pass it over to him for some introductory remarks.
Great. Thank you, Bill. So welcome everyone to the final Spotlight event in our spring series. And much of what happens creatively at Ucross is really due in large part to the many rewarding partnerships we enjoy with other leading arts organizations. So we're especially pleased to conclude the season with a celebration of our partnership with the PEN Hemingway Award for debut novel, which is now in its 26th year. As we gradually approach our 40th anniversary as a residency program, we're honored to recognize PEN Hemingway as our longest standing partner. Back, I don't know what happened. As Bill mentioned, Sharon, our president and executive director, hasn't been feeling well. She had her second COVID shot yesterday and is still recovering. So on Sharon's behalf, I really want to welcome and introduce our very special guest tonight, Ucross Fellows and PEN Hemingway award-winning authors Ottessa Moshfegh and Joshua Ferris. By way of background, Ottessa Moshfegh is a fiction writer from New England. Otessa's first novel, Eileen, was shortlisted for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Man Booker Prize, and won the PEN Hemingway Award for debut novel. My Year of Rest and Relaxation and Death in Her Hands, her second and third novels, were New York Times bestsellers. Ottessa is also the author of a short story collection, Homesick for Another World, and a novella, Maglue. She currently lives in Southern California. So Ottessa, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, and Joshua Ferris is the author of 4 novels, including A Calling for Charlie Barnes, to be published in September, and a collection of stories, The Dinner Party. Joshua was a finalist for the National Book Award, winner of the Barnes & Noble Discover Award, and he also won the Dylan Thomas Prize and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Joshua's short stories have appeared in The New Yorker, Granta, and Best American Short Stories. He lives in New York. Welcome, Joshua.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Real pleasure. So before I turn the program back to Bill, who will serve as moderator this evening, we have a special introduction we'd like to play from Sean Hemingway. Bill?
Yep.
Hello, my name is Sean Hemingway, and it gives me great pleasure to be here today, albeit virtually, with the Ucross community and welcome you on behalf of the Hemingway family. Ucross has partnered with PEN Hemingway since 1995, and this is its 26th year. During those 2.5 decades, Ucross has provided residencies to nearly 70 PEN Hemingway Award winners, finalists, and honorable mentions. The partnership was initiated by award-winning writer Annie Proulx, who was a Ucross trustee and PEN Hemingway judge at the time. Ucross's long-standing support for PEN Hemingway Award writers is part of what makes this award for debut authors so special. Winners and finalists benefit from the recognition and support that the award provides, and many of them benefit from the time and space provided by Ucross. My grandfather once said that writing was at its best a lonely life. he would have appreciated the sanctuary that the Ucross Foundation provides writers on its beautiful Wyoming ranch. In fact, the partnership with Ucross is especially meaningful because of Ernest Hemingway's connection with the American West. He finished writing A Farewell to Arms in the Bighorn Mountains near Ucross, and Wyoming will host part of the Hemingway Society's International Conference next summer. We hope we will all have the chance to gather in person again at the John F. Kennedy Library for the award ceremony in Boston next year. The list of winners for the PEN Hemingway Award for a debut novel is truly impressive. Writers such as Joshua Ferris and Ottessa Moshfegh, and you will hear from both of these incredible authors, PEN Hemingway winners, and Ucross Fellows tonight. Thank you for coming to this event. Thank you for believing in the importance of literature, and thank you for supporting writers, PEN Hemingway, and Ucross.
All right. Well, that was a wonderful welcoming remarks from Sean. He did a lot of work there for me. I'm going to probably recap a little bit of what he said, because I'm going to provide a little context about the partnership and it's how meaningful it is to Ucross. So as Sean said there, Ucross's partnership with the PEN Hemingway Award began 26 years ago. In fact, it was the very first partnership that Ucross engaged in or entered in with a national arts organization. So it is dear to our hearts and it's dear to our organization. And I know it's very near and dear to Sharon, who really helped bring this thing forward. As Sean mentioned, it was Annie Prue who proposed the collaboration when she was a trustee at Ucross. And, Annie knew well, she clearly understood the importance of uninterrupted time for writers. And she knew firsthand the creative power of the Wyoming landscape and the inspiration that the high plains provided. So many PEN Hemingway honorees, both winners and finalists, have told us that the validation they receive and the recognition that comes with being an honoree and in being invited to be a Ucross resident has been critical to their creative process and into them as emerging writers. So for those who don't know, and I imagine there's a few of you on the Zoom right now that don't, Ucross at any given time will have 10 artists in residence. It's usually 4 writers, 4 visual artists, and 2 composers, but the mix varies. And most of the time they do have, the time and space provided, uninterrupted time and space provided in their studios, but they also gather together in the evenings over a dinner that is provided by the chef, Cindy Brooks. And it's during that dinner that a lot of emerging writers or emerging artists and established writers, established artists get to connect with one another and get to build a relationship. It's during that time that collaboration happens, cross-disciplinary discussion, cross-cultural discussion happens, and a community is built. And many of the PEN Hemingway honorees have really talked about how important that community that's built at Ucross is. The collaboration itself, the PEN Hemingway collaboration, also organizationally marked a huge and significant moment at pivot point for Ucross, really, because it was when we decided to take active steps to work closely with more organizations around the country. This helped raise the visibility of Ucross as a resource for writers, but it also at the same time helped us broaden our artist pool, our applicant pool, and our artists, those who attended. And it was soon after that, only a couple of years after the PEN Hemingway, which served really as a pilot and a model, that we began partnerships with the Sundance Institute and the Herb Alpert Award and many others that continue to this day. And it's really an important part of our ecosystem. So in short, I would say the PEN Hemingway partnership with Ucross helps transforms the lives of writers, but has also transformed our organization as well. So we are grateful to everyone involved, to Sean for his kind words there, to the Hemingway Society and the Hemingway family, to PEN America, and to the entire literary community. So that's the setup, that's the context. We are happy to have Joshua and Otessa here tonight. And I think we're just going to jump right in here with a question. And I would say to both of you, Joshua and Ottessa, you came to Ucross at different points, maybe at different stages of your writing lives. Joshua, you were first here in 2008, and I think that was soon after you had won the award for Then We Came to an End.
That's right.
And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience of coming to Ucross at the beginning of your career as when you were an emerging writer, and if that sort of experience, the remoteness of Wyoming was a shock, or was it you just were all in and you were going? We'll just start there, I guess.
Okay. I had been writing a long time, so I didn't feel as if I were doing really anything different than I had been doing for quite some time, but in a radically different context. I mean, I had never had that view before, and I had never had the kind of care taken to assure that my time was entirely my own, to the point that, by God, every day at noon there was my lunch. That was extraordinary, and I mean, I just felt pampered. You feel pampered at Ucross. You feel beloved. You feel respected. You feel you just kind of, I think, I'd never felt anything quite like the care that had taken to ensure that I was comfortable and productive. So in that respect, it was an entirely new experience. I was writing my second novel at that time, and it had a lot to do with the landscape. It had a lot to do with landscape that I wasn't terribly familiar with, which Wyoming certainly was. And so I absorbed an enormous amount of, I observed an enormous amount, and I just took it all in. And I remember one day in particular, there was a truck doing something, maybe hunting or something, and the catalytic converter or something on this truck, got so overheated that it exploded and caught fire. And I don't think, small wildfires are all that unusual, but it was kind of unusual for me. And I remember just being completely seduced by this wildfire and watching it for hours and wondering what the hell was going to happen and all the rest of it. And that worked in my imagination. I mean, around that time, the world was starting to percolate about climate change and all the rest. And that was the first time that I had seen such a dynamic and somewhat dangerous landscape. So it was very informative to the book that I went on to write.
And that was The Unnamed? Is that?
That was The Unnamed. Yeah.
Nice. So, so Ucross did have a contribution to that second novel.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, whenever I evoke the West in that book, which toward the end of it is quite often, it's always Ucross.
Right.
I'd like to take credit for something more imaginative, but there you have it.
Well, it's funny because the fires provide a little bit of a segue here, because I think Ottessa, so you won the award for Eileen back in 2016, but your first time at Ucross was last fall in the middle of the pandemic. And also while wildfires were rolling through the West. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your experience when we were, in pandemic residency mode, and social distancing was, intense, even more so with our 20,000 acres. But I wondered, how your impressions and feelings about your residency in that context.
Well, I'll say that I had tried to come to Ucross. I tried to schedule my residency several times, and something always came up where it's like, oh, at the last minute, everything came together. It's like, oh, shoot, I'm going to have to put this off again. And last fall, I had it's really funny hearing Joshua talk about the wildfires, because I had an inverse experience where I live in Southern California. I had gone up north to the Oregon coast to collaborate on a project, and was forced to leave because of the fires in Oregon. Then I came home to Southern California knowing that the Angeles Mountains were on fire here, and that my neighborhood had been on evacuation warning, like get ready to go for weeks. And I'd been tracking the fire and thinking, well, maybe it's okay to come home. And it absolutely was not. I could barely breathe in my house. So I went out to the desert and took a day trip from where I was staying. And while I was up on a mountain, I got a call that a fire had broken out around the corner from the house in the desert. So that's 3 in a row. I was like, I'm not supposed to be here. God is calling me somewhere else. Also, am I doing this? So I wrote to the foundation and told them I was desperate and that I could come immediately. And I think I was on the road in a matter of like 2 days or something. And it was like, you know, talk about a breath of fresh air. I was so relieved. I mean, just being on the open road was a relief. And then I mean, everything Joshua talked about being cared for and having this safe place where my heart isn't racing, but rather like, you know, totally engaged in what I love to do. And it being pandemic, it felt, you know, it's kind of ironic that I needed an escape from the isolation of quarantining, or, you know, the isolation of the pandemic, but it actually was like really nice to have a change of scenery, and that the change of scenery was Ucross was magical. It was totally magical. And I barely spoke to anyone. I took drives into Sheridan, and I got a lot of work done, like more work done than I had done in a long time. So yeah, I was just extremely happy to be there.
How long were you there?
I was there for 4 weeks.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear. I mean, for many reasons. I think one is that it emphasizes that, you know, when you are honored either as a finalist or a winner for the Hemingway Award and you receive your Ucross residency, it's not like you have to use it within 6 months. It is a relationship that we've built over time, and it's when it fits with the writer's schedule and life. And then second, I think it's you know, I think we do hear often, and Tracy does such a wonderful job with the scheduling and accommodating everyone, and, you know, Sharon as well. And I think we heard often over the last 6 months how important and valuable, meaningful it was to get away to Ucross during the pandemic. And it feels, you know, that escape from your sort of, I guess, everyday isolation to a new isolation, but one where you can focus on your creativity and also feel that you are being nurtured and kept safe, has been super productive for many artists, at least we've heard. So that it's wonderful to hear. So before we get into more questions, I think we all want to hear each of you read, if you'd be so kind to do so.
Sure.
So Joshua, do you want to start? Do you want to maybe provide a little setup? And
Sure.
All right.
I'm going to read from a new book, my new novel called A Calling for Charlie Barnes. And I should say the book is more or less about my dad. My dad's name was Chuck Ferris. And he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2007. And he basically, you know, when you get pancreatic cancer, you basically bite the dust. I mean, that's kind of how it goes. And I think maybe I was named the finalist for the winner maybe of the Penn Hemingway in, like, I don't know, I don't quite remember when, but maybe February or March. And he was still alive, and he had been lucky enough to have the Whipple procedure, which is the last ditch only surgical option for a very small subset of those folks that are diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. where they go in, and I'm giving you a little bit of background because that's the character of the book as well. So you'll just pick it up from there. But they go in and they kind of like remove a bunch of guts and other things, and then sew you back up from ass to your elbow and pray for the best. And my old man somehow lived. Like, it was quite a miracle. In fact, he lived, I want to say, about 7 more years, but we didn't know, right? We didn't know that he would live. I mean, he had this surgery in like the beginning of October of 2007, shortly after my first book came out. And like, it was all wrapped up in that. His sickness was wrapped up in my publication. I was on the road and dealing, you know, with that and him being sick. And then this news came in, and he was very, very frail when the ceremony, I think in what is that, in April or May or something like that.
Yep.
Very frail, but he flew. And it was like the first time that a new family goes out with a little baby. It was like the first time he was bringing his new guts to an event, like far away. And, you know, he had to be so delicate because he like weighed 120 pounds or some ridiculous thing. And there he was, alive and thriving in his modest way for a guy that had just had such an ordeal. And it was incredibly meaningful to me to have him there, because it meant that he got to see me accept this award basically before he died. And I didn't know that he was going to live for much longer. And so it was, this award is wrapped up for me, this particular award, accepting this particular award, being named it and all, that's wrapped up with me and him. And I loved him dearly. I loved him so much, I wrote a book about it, and I'll read from it. This is sort of takes place shortly after he's had this procedure and he's not well. And yeah, here it goes. So he was home, so he would live. So what? The poor man had no appetite for food, for the newspaper, for telephone calls, and what was life without appetite? He subsisted on black coffee and protein shakes, mortally afraid of moving and tearing internally something he couldn't name, but that he knew he needed. His regrets played on a loop. Depression, that still beast, came to roost. Depression laid its black eggs in him, which hatched, howled for food, and grew stronger on dark thoughts. It was not the cancer, but the reckoning that came close to killing him. To get up in the morning with a big gash in your side, to sweat through breakfast, to tremble, to feel tired and weak, to crawl from spot to spot, to endure, nothing more, and to go on enduring because it beats the alternative, is to confront the day with a lot of willpower. That was not my father. He sat, did nothing, healed, while time, as changing headlines, turning seasons, continued unabated. His surgeon, a lifesaver and a straightforwardly factual man, stated that the surgical team got clean margins and chemo was very good at taking care of the rest, but the patient had to eat or he would not live. The patient just shrugged. What was food to him? Then one morning I set down before him a plate of eggs that I scrambled with whole milk and butter, and that did the trick. He scarfed it down. He wanted nothing but eggs after that, prepared just that way, 3 at a time, salted and piping hot. It was that perfect meal one goes chasing for years afterward, the rekindling of an appetite given up for dead, a rebirth. And for an entire month, he ate 3 meals a day of 3 eggs apiece and nothing more. We watched more TV than you could possibly imagine, more even than when I was in high school and living with him in Evangeline and Downers Grove. Back then, we had a 32-inch Sony Triniton console set in solid oak, which he worked from his recliner by the luxury of remote control. I was 16. I bought a replica of that remote at a Radio Shack in the mall and synced it to the television. On nights I was especially bored, I would climb from my window and stand outside the house on Benton Avenue, moving the volume subtly up and down. Sometimes I changed the channel. My father liked Channel 7. I liked Channel 9. He would look up from his newspaper. He was never in front of the television without his newspaper, confounded by the sudden change. It seemed to have taken place entirely by some occult power. He reached for his remote on the TV tray and restored order before going back to his newspaper. I would let maybe a minute pass before changing it back to Channel 9. He looked up, very solemn. I still have my regrets about this. I had not yet emerged from my punk-ass bitch phase. His mouth gone slack in mystification. What the hell is going on with my television? He got to his feet and pulled the curtain back. Insecure Charlie Barnes was the first to believe that someone might be toying with him as he peered angrily out into the night. I was well hidden, but silently shaking with laughter. On a different night, he simply stood up and started banging on the television, as if that ever works. I could still see him. Well, why shouldn't it work? I correlated one of those bangs with a channel change, then another, and another, until he had every reason to believe that his Sony was obeying him in this crudest of manners, like appeasing an angry God. And when at last he could be trusted that Channel 7 would hold, he carefully withdrew, picking across the carpet backward and reaching out with a blind hand for the seat of the recliner, keeping his eye glued to the screen until he was seated again, this time very demurely on the lip of the recliner, as if fully occupying it might tempt fate. How carefully he sat there. I gave it a full 2 minutes before returning it to Channel 9. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. So that was great. I mean, I'll have some questions. Follow-up questions to that. I think we'll go to Ottessa first to do a reading. That way I can ask you both about your current projects. So Ottessa, do you want to do a setup and
Yeah. I thought that I would read from the book that I revised Ucross last fall. It's going to come out like a year from now. It's a novel, and it takes place in the late Middle Ages in a totally fictional fiefdom in Eastern Europe. And it's told in the third person. There's a cast of characters, and the book basically tells the story of this town and a transformation it goes through over the course of a year and a couple of months. So it begins in spring and then it ends the next spring. And I thought I would just read from the beginning. It's the book that, it was like my COVID year book. I wasn't planning on writing this book. I had another book that I was supposed to be writing. And when the quarantine began, I was like, there's no way that I can pretend creatively, like I can just keep going, doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Like I needed to respond to something in some way, and also have a new project to feel like I have something to attach to, or else like I was just gonna get really depressed. So I wrote this novel, and its name is the name of this village, Lapvona, Lapvona, which is a totally made up word. So I thought I would just read the opening, and so yeah, you'll get a sense of what it is like. So this is Lapvona. The bandits came again on Easter. This time they slaughtered 2 men, 3 women, and 2 small children. Some smelting tools were stolen from the blacksmith, but no gold or silver, as there was none. One of the bandits was injured by an axe wielded by the slain children's mother. She smashed his left foot. Then he was restrained by neighbors and dragged to the village square, where he was beaten and put in the pillory. Villagers pelted him with mud and animal excrement until nightfall. Grigor, the dead children's grandfather, was too bereft to sleep, so he got up in the night, went to the square, cut off the bandit's ear with a garden knife and flung it in a lemon tree laden with blossoms for the birds to eat, he yelled at the bleeding man and sobbed as he slunk away. Nobody could say what specific acts of horror this one pilloried bandit had committed. The rest of the bandits got away and took with them 6 geese, 4 goats, 6 wheels of cheese, and a cask of honey, in addition to the iron tools. No lambs were stolen, as the lamb herder, Jude, lived in a pasture several miles from the center of the village, and he had his lambs penned and sleeping soundly that night as usual. The pasture was at the foot of a hill, on top of sat the large stone manor William, Lapvona's lord and governor, resided. His guards were in position to defend him should any menacing individual ever climb the hill. Between the echoing screams from the village, Jude thought he could hear the gut strings of the guards' bows tighten from where he lay awake by the fire that night. It was not by chance that Jude and his son, Marek, lived in the pasture below the manor. William and Jude shared a blood relation, their great-grandfather. Jude thought of William as his cousin, though the two men had never met. On Monday, Marek, age 13, walked to the village to assist in digging a trench to bury the dead. He wanted to be helpful, but cowered when the bodies were laid out on the thick grass of the cemetery and the men took up their shovels. The heads of the dead were covered only in cloths. Marek imagined that their faces were still alive. He could see their eyelashes grazing the fabric as a soft wind blew. He saw the outlines of their lips and thought they were moving, speaking to him, warning him to get away. The children's bodies looked like wooden dolls, stiff and adorable. Marek crossed himself and retreated back to the road. The men of the village dug the trench easily without him anyway. Nobody cared that Marek had come and gone. He was like a stray dog that wandered in and out of the village from time to time, and everyone knew he was a bastard. Marek was a small boy and had grown crookedly, his spine twisted in the middle so that the right side of his rib cage protruded from his torso, which caused his arm to find its only comfort resting half bent across his belly. His left arm hung loose from its socket. His legs were bowed. His head was also misshapen, although he hid his skull under a tattered knit hat, bright red hair that had never once been brushed or caught. His father, whose long, uncut hair was brown, admonished vanity as a cardinal sin. There were no mirrors in their humble home in the pasture, not that they had any earnings to afford one. Jude was the oldest bachelor in Lapvona. Other men took their cousins as their wives if they needed one. Women often died in childbirth or traded a few sheep or pigs to a village in the north for a tall girl to marry. Jude could never bear to see his reflection, not even in the clear, icy stream that ran through the valley or in the lake where he went to bathe a few times a year. He also believed that Marek ought not see himself. He was glad to have a son and not a daughter whose lack of beauty would be much more injurious. Marek was ugly and fragile, not at all like Jude, whose bones and muscles were like polished bluffs beaten by an ocean, soft and luminous, despite his skin being grimy and often covered in lamb shit. Jude never let on that Marek's face had an unseemly disproportion. The boy's forehead was high and veiny, his nose bulbous and skewed, his cheeks flat and pale, his lips thin, his chin a stub, giving way to a neck that was wrinkled and soft, like a drape of skin over his throat, which was flabby at the apple. Beauty is the devil's shade, Jude said. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. Wish they had a little, I know they have the reaction button, but I wish there's a little applause button. Thank you both for your readings. You kind of, in your setups had sort of gotten to my first question, which is really about your new work, the work that's coming out. And Joshua, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about why this book now. You sort of recalled back to 2007, 2008, and you've had a couple of works published in between then and now, well, 3 or 4 between then and now. So why Charlie Barnes now?
It's a good question. I suppose that it's about being middle-aged myself, 45, around the time that my father's marriage with my mother came to an end, and an understanding probably a little bit more of what his life was like at 45, and thinking, this is interesting. Like I actually resisted this book for a long time because I don't find it all that rewarding or interesting to write autobiographically. The biographical facts don't ignite my imagination. They don't excite my motivation. They don't tend to sort of like call to me in some way that seems to justify all the time and energy it takes to write a novel. But my father lived this extremely imagined life to some extent. In other words, it was a life informed by the imagination. And so frequently he would get excited about ideas, mainly for businesses or companies or some kind of profit-making endeavor that seemed entirely fictional. It seemed predicated entirely upon what gets fiction writers excited about their own ideas. And I started to see these parallels, but if I were to have suggested to him that it was made of the same stuff that I made stories and novels out of, I think he would have been offended. He would have thought, sort of, what you do, son, is child's play. It's sort of, it even had sort of like a mid-century, probably not misogynistic exactly, but a kind of like very definite gender sense that this was a somewhat feminine thing to do, to write novels, right? And yet his entire, like, what energized him and what got him sort of really excited about life was no more sort of, imagined or really kind of thinly in the world as what I was doing. And so I saw these parallels. And then by the time that I hit 55 or 45, I realized, oh my God, my life consists of enormous numbers of fictions that I truly have to believe in. I have to believe in these myths and these kind of like these fibs about the family and these kind of like, constructs in any number of ways that sort of propped me up and kept me going and kept the family going and kind of keeps the country and the world going. And that's when I realized that he was the vessel for that, and an opportunity for me to really talk about fiction as it informs our real lives and how fiction, or how our real lives inform fiction. And so there's a play there that I don't think would have occurred to me until I became about, the age that, let's say 40 to 45. So that's why now.
I mean, and I guess it's switching gears completely, but I mean, Otessa, I'm curious about your world building, your character building, and when this sort of, you said this is your COVID novel, when you, I guess, came up with this idea for this book, or how the idea evolved, and how how the year unfolded may have influenced it.
Well, so I wasn't completely unprepared to write the novel that I did in one sense, because I had been thinking about a scenario that I wanted to put in a novel. And it was very simple. It was just that one boy kills another boy. And the parents of the dead boy, for reasons that I hadn't yet figured out, couldn't go to the authorities and say, this boy has murdered our son and he must be punished. Instead, they decided that they would take this boy as their son and that would be his punishment, and it would also fulfill their need for their now this hole in their life where that they had lost their son but gained one, so live with that now. And then I think I really like writing about the past. I mean, I do, like, McGlue was sort of like a pseudo historical novella, with my first book that I did a lot of research for. And I really love working in that way, in worlds that are sort of intuitive and familiar, but also completely weird. And to somehow, like, my world feels like I have to make that feel authentic, at least to the point where you're not worried about it as the reader. So I wanted to go in time, and I thought about my ancestors. From my mother's side of the family is Croatian, and she's always telling me that, like, we're descendant from pirates. Like, doing business on the Adriatic. And I was like, is that really true? Or is that just her way of being like, look, we're all like, we're a family of badasses, so you have to be a badass and not let anything get to you. I was like, okay. So anyway, like, I did a little bit of research into that and just sort of discovered like Eastern Europe and the Middle Ages as a time. I mean, it could have been anything really, but I was attracted to it as a time and a world, and decided to stick on land to tell my story, and then got really into thinking about land and the way that it's divided and used and ruled. And so much was being reflected back at me through news media, which is all I could do to understand what the fuck was in the world. Well, it definitely made an impression on the way that I structured my village.
Mhm.
And it's also a little bit of a magical novel. I mean, there's a character who's not completely human, and she's sort of she's a very important person in the book. And the book also deals a lot with religion and faith and God and death. And I still wanted it to be funny. I was just like going through it basically, and took this time as the occasion to allow myself to do something really different. It's the first book that I've written in the third person. I was getting really sick of writing in the first person. Yeah, I felt like super out of my element, and that felt great, really exciting. I got to write about really disturbing stuff and like get it out of my system. And I ended up really liking Lapvona. Like, I liked spending time there. I was spending all the rest of my time in Pasadena.
Well, it's funny. I laugh because you're talking about the first person, but my next question is really going to be about voice. I mean, I think we have the two of you. I mean, it's sort of, we have a masterclass on voice here, and I think in Joshua, I think your reading there was both playful, but full of that voice, and I wonder how you approach it. And Otessa, I do. Even in that third person, it has such a strong and compelling voice to it, and energy to it already that it's going to pull you into the novel. I just wonder, and maybe we can't, combine this into one question for the both of you, but I kind of wonder what your approaches are to finding the right voice. Where do you start? Do you start with character? Do you start with research? Is research important to you? Is it a curiosity? Or those sort of informed by imagination and ideas, as Joshua, you said? Where does it start, and how do you get to the moment where you find the right voice for the book?
I'm more interested in hearing Ottessa on this than my blather. What do you say? You want to go first?
Okay. I don't really have a good answer. It's a very good question. I don't really have a very good answer for how I've come upon the voice. I mean, usually it's just like through writing. I mean, I just ask myself like, well, what does this character sound like? You know, it's like sort of the most obvious thing because I think in words, right? Like my mind speaks to myself or speaks to me in language. So I know what a voice sounds like. And I also know what a voice does to manipulate people into following it and keep listening. And so I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to write without the voice.
I
I
think
don't
maybe, you know, it's like voice can be, it can be thin. It can be great, but sort of empty. And you have to guard against that to some extent. It can be very seductive. And there are books that get carried on entirely by their voice. And then at the end, you're like, I'm not sure that there was any there. And so I think you have to have, oddly, you have to have a very, very, very high standard for what might be a very, very basic voice, because there has to not be just the cadence or just the intelligence or just the appeal, but there has to be something behind that. And yet it can't reveal itself entirely as being in service to that thing. So, you know, you might just start, as Otessa says, just writing. But then at a certain point, the voice fails to carry. It fails to elevate. And something else has to enter in and buttress the voice or, you know, support the voice in some way that makes it not just a personality. It's almost as if when that happens, it's almost as if the book goes from having a personality to having a character, you know, a deepening of some kind of, you know, meaning or meaningfulness that might carry the book along.
Yes, I think that's, you know, I think it's an interesting, if I were to try to encapsulate that, it seems like, you know, it's the process of writing and the process of exploration in the writing that then begins to stitch all of these elements together, right? That's, you're not necessarily just driven by a voice or just driven by character development, but what the writing demands as you're evolving.
Yeah, you know, that scene that I just read, for a long time, it didn't belong in the book. And then I realized that what I needed to do, and I cut off before getting to it, which would investigate why this kid was basically torturing his father. And then when you realize what that is, you know, what the undercurrent of the psychology and the motivation is, then it's more than just an amusement. And I think that's what I'm always trying to do is convey humor or compelling language of one sort or another, but always make sure that there's this subtext going on that is, you know, really driving it forward and making it much more compelling than just appealing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, and that's very clear, at least to me, reading all of your books. I think that the humor and the absurdity that's in it is the subtext is underpinning it, that it makes it more meaningful and carries the weight for you. And I think Otessa, I think that the same may be true of sort of the, you know, the noirish or the dark quality in some of your work, that the subtext and underpinnings of everything that is going on is what is doing a lot of the work. I wonder if we could, you know, just take, you know, because we're actually about 50 minutes in. That was quick. I wonder if we could just turn it back a little bit to the Penn Hemingway Awards and to that moment in your career and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but what it meant for you at that time, or looking back, you know, whether it's 5 years or 14 years, looking back on it, what do you think it has meant to your the trajectory of your career or to your connection to the literary community or to your writing process, or is that just all overblown? I just want, want to pull it back to the Penn Hemingway though, and what it's meant. Otessa, do you want?
Yeah, sure. What it meant at the time was like a big sign from the universe that I was moving in the right direction, and that a lot of the it's so funny when these prizes for debut fiction, because it's not the first thing that somebody writes, it's the first thing that gets published in a specific way. So in like what Joshua was saying is like, well, he'd been writing for years and years and years before people called him an emerging writer. I mean, he was already a writer. I mean, in a way that it's like having my first novel come out and then having that incredible compliment and prize of the Penn Hemingway Award was like, you did the right thing, like all the times where you doubted whether you were doing the right thing, and it's cool, like just keep going. And it really did. I mean, it helped me afford to live in a very practical way, to keep writing, and also, I mean, this is kind of just irrelevant maybe to the prize, but the fact that it was in my home, the prize ceremony, and Josh actually presented me with the prize, which is really cool to see him again. The fact that it was in Boston and meant that my parents could both come, and like my old piano teacher showed up, and my best girlfriend from high school was there, and it was just like this sort of like full circle feeling of, okay, like this is an actual, I'm not one to celebrate accomplishments, but it's like, I'm happy about this. It felt good, and it felt good that everybody was happy for me.
Yeah. It does feel good. I tell you, here's a little inside baseball. And it kind of connects, Bill, to your earlier question about voice. We didn't talk. I don't know, the other jurors and I didn't talk about your book, Otessa, for a long time. Like, I forget exactly how it worked. Like, it has been 5 years, so I don't really remember. Did we read them in installments, or how do we do this? But there was this ton of debate back and forth about very good books, and we were at odds, but it was, very amenable odds. And then I read Eileen late, and I think before anybody else did, but like literally a week before we were even meeting, or a week before we were naming the prize. And the voice in that book does not really bespeak of someone who's a debut novelist. It defies the categories because it comes straight out of what is indisputably a consummate artist, somebody who just knows what to do on the page, in the same way that the reading you just gave conveys confidence and a surety that this is the world that you're going to enter and be in. And it was so obvious to me. And I remember, as I say, me and the other jurors, we were at odds, but I sent the quick email saying, it just strikes me as pretty obvious that Eileen is the best book on the list. And they quickly read Eileen and sent back an email saying, Eileen's the best book on the list. And we just had our winner. Like, there was no dispute, there was no debate, it was just a quick boom, we're done, and it was wonderful. So thank you for writing it, because it made our lives as jurors incredibly easy. And I think that that's what sort of happens, is that something like Eileen is identified for standing out considerably from the rest of the pack, because it's coming from a slightly different place than the rest. It just came from a different place than the rest. We read a ton of books that year, and we had incredible runners up. We just had and 2 or 3 books that didn't make that list that were absolutely incredible, but there was a difference. And I think that what you get for being the winner of the PEN Hemingway is this, it is an incredible compliment, but there's also this triumvirate of things. There's the John F. Kennedy Library and the Hemingway room there that overwhelms you with literary history, and then the JFK element of the whole museum, and the PEN, the fact of PEN and its presence and its support. And then Ucross, I suppose, is more than a triumvirate. It's just this, and then at that time anyway, when I got it, was the University of Utah had sponsored a week. I don't know if that's still the case, but it seems to be the prize that just keeps on giving. And at that moment in time, when you just, I mean, you know that somebody's listening because they've published your book and they can't really take that away from you. But they're still in that life of a, during that time of a right of, you know, during that life, that period of time of a writer, it can still seem like, am I privately writing here? Am I writing for 2 people? Am I writing for just my mom? What's going on? And then you get this thing that has the support of all of these incredible institutions and this history. And it just makes you feel like a real person. You're a real person, by God, at least for the next 6 months. And then you go to Ucross and you feel pampered and adored, and it's really a treat.
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, part of it asked that question, I guess, because we are so sort of enamored with all of our PEN Hemingway residents, people who come to be artists in residence. And it's been really meaningful for us to have the relationship and to see the sort of literary community that we, even this sort of small, not so small, but, you know, the PEN Hemingway alumni of Ucross, to see all of them connect and reconnect and join us at events and come to you know, spotlight and read for us. I think, you know, it's heartening, and it's been very meaningful to us, and it's really helped us grow Ucross and its visibility. So it's been very meaningful to us, and it, you know, we have that question, I guess we can end on, but that question about how meaningful it's been to both of you. And so I don't see any questions in the comment stream here, and I think, you know, I think that's a good way to sort of to close and to thank you both for your time and for your readings. And I would say, Joshua, your comment about the confidence that you, when you first read Eileen, what you saw in that, I think we could all say for the same of the point of view, and then we came to an end. You know, and I think in both cases, yeah, you were standout, we'll put in quotes, emerging writers at the time, and you're you know, superstars now. So we're very grateful that you joined us tonight.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you, Bill.
yeah, and you know, I guess to wrap up, of course, I want to thank our sponsors of the Ucross Spotlight series, the spring series. I think that you know, anything you can do to support Ucross and support our writers, buy their books, get out there and see them, give their books to your friends. That's much appreciated. I also want to say that our commitment to PEN Hemingway continues this year. We have several PEN Hemingway Award winners and runners-up coming to be in residence soon, including, let's see, Kwame Strong Washburn. I have, you know, Sharks in the Time of Saviors, which won this year. He'll be coming soon, that wonderful book. And we have Ruchika Tomar, who's going to be coming soon for A Prayer for Travelers, I think maybe this fall. And then Madeline Fitch will be coming. She was a runner-up in 2020 for Stay and Fight, will also be coming this fall. So it continues. The good work that all these writers are doing continues. The good work PEN Hemingway does continues. And again, we thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everyone have a good night, have a good summer. And if you would like to share this video, it will be on our website tomorrow. It will be on our YouTube, it will be on Facebook, of course. So share it with your friends. And I hope both of your book launches go well. We'll be waiting in anticipation.
Thanks.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.